Welcome to the Apollo Planetarium. Please take a seat and familiarize yourself with the three consoles. The console in front of you is the video player. You can watch a trailer or purchase the award-winning 3D film Capcom Go, The Apollo Story. This console controls an experimental holoscope. Try placing an object on the glowing pad.
The command module is the only part of the Apollo craft that will return to Earth, and is where the astronauts spend most of their time in space. The service module has the engines, fuel, and oxygen needed to get into the orbit of the Moon and back home to Earth. The Saturn V was first built over 50 years ago to put humans on the Moon. It is still one of the most powerful rockets ever built and stands nearly 111 meters high. The astronauts have to wear special suits to survive the extreme environment of the Moon and keep them safe during launch and re-entry. The lunar module is the only part of the Apollo craft to land on the Moon. The lower half of these spacecraft can still be found on the surface of the Moon today. The lunar rover is a two-person electric vehicle included on the Apollo 15, 16, and 17 missions. It folds up like origami to fit in, and the batteries are cooled with beeswax.
This console controls the star ball for a beautiful view of the night sky. Don't forget to try the music player and laser show.
can see you coming down the ladder now.
It was the 20th of July, 1969. All over the world, people were gathered around television sets and radios. They knew they were witnessing an historic moment of human achievement, broadcast live from the surface of the moon.
Yeah, I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The world celebrated as the astronauts took their first steps on the moon. But few people would have been aware just how huge an effort it had taken to get them there. These Apollo 11 astronauts were just two of nearly 400,000 people who had worked over 10 years towards this goal. But how did they do it? What did it take to put humans on the moon? Our story starts in the 1950s, when rival superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, begin competing to build the best spacecraft. The Soviets achieved the first triumph when they put the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, into orbit. 1 month later, they launched a second satellite, this time with a living passenger, a dog named Laika. Working hard to catch up, the Americans launched their first satellite, Explorer 1, the following year. Within 3 years, they had advanced their technologies enough to successfully launch and return Ham the chimp. But then the Soviets achieved another major triumph. They successfully launched cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, who became the first human to orbit the Earth. Less than a month later, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space. His successful flight gave America confidence in its space program.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
Before we find out how NASA planned to get to the moon, we need to cover the basics. First, distance. The moon is about 400,000 kilometers from Earth, so far that all the other planets in the solar system could fit between us. It is in constant motion, completing an orbit of Earth in just over 27 days. On the moon, there is no air to breathe, and the sunlit surface gets very hot, up to 127 degrees Celsius. But it gets cold in the shadows, dropping to minus 173 degrees. So, how did NASA plan to get people to cross this great distance and survive such extreme conditions? The plan was to break the journey into stages. The first of those was getting off the ground. For this, they designed the mighty Saturn V. 3 stacked rockets made it the most powerful launch system ever. Rather than land the whole spacecraft on the moon, NASA built a small landing craft, which was latched on for the ride. This would be the astronauts' home on the surface and return them to the main craft. Next, they had to consider the length of the journey. NASA calculated that it would take about 4 days to reach the moon. The craft had to be able to carry all the food, water, air, and fuel the 3 astronauts needed to reach the moon, and for their 4-day journey back. 2 astronauts would descend in the lunar module, leaving 1 in orbit. But to walk on the moon, they would need spacesuits. These would need to protect the astronauts and be flexible enough to move easily. Finally, they'd need to get home. The tiny craft that would land in the sea was just a small part of the tip of the giant Saturn V. This great project was called Apollo. Once they had a plan, NASA began to select astronauts by recruiting the best test pilots. The first group and their families moved to Houston to begin training in 1963. NASA recruited the best scientists, engineers, and mathematicians to design the components of the mission. They also called in support from specialist companies and universities around the country. This meant that the astronauts had to travel all over the United States. One day they would be in Virginia, training to land on the moon. The next, they would be in the Los Angeles harbor, training with the Navy for their return to Earth. Days later, they would be in Houston, practicing to set up experiments in their spacesuits. Then they would be sent to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. From here, they would be launched into space to test the new systems and spacecraft. In orbit, they also learned how to perform spacewalks. As their spacecraft orbited the Earth, radio telescopes around the world enabled constant communication with the astronauts. This international communication network made it possible to run the moon missions from a single building in Houston, Texas. Mission control.
Okay, all flight controllers.
Due to the complexity of the spacecraft, the astronauts were supported 24 hours a day by teams of scientists, engineers, and doctors. By watching the data displayed at these desks, they were able to help the astronauts control the spacecraft. Everything was monitored here, from the position and speed of the craft to the astronauts' health. All the teams constantly updated flight control, the person in charge of the room, and keeping the mission going according to plan.
Tell you guys are doing a good job. Tell them to keep it up.
But only one person was allowed to talk to the crew. That was Capcom, the capsule communicator.
Roger, copy. Eagle looking great. Your go.
The astronauts preferred to talk to one of their own, so Capcom was usually a trained astronaut too. While the astronauts were busy training and testing the craft that would carry them to the moon, someone needed to figure out the spacecraft trajectories required to get them there. In space, travel is complicated as everything is in motion. The moon itself is moving at over 3,500 kilometers an hour. So, to calculate the speeds, mass, and forces the spacecraft needed, NASA needed exceptional people, like Katherine Johnson. She led a group of mathematicians to get a spacecraft to the moon, using no more than pencils, equations, and their brilliant minds. In the early days, the mathematicians themselves were called computers. But as the new electronic computers became more reliable, many of these women became programmers, creating new software for spaceflight. It was Margaret Hamilton's team that wrote the computer software that would allow the Apollo astronauts to get to and land on the moon. Kennedy's declaration to be the first to land on the moon and achieve it by the end of the decade put enormous pressure on everyone involved in the Apollo program. As a result, an early Apollo spacecraft was hurriedly assembled and delivered, untested. On the 27th of January 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White were conducting a flight rehearsal. Throughout the exercise, there were problems, as communication links between mission control and the capsule systems kept failing. Gus Grissom exclaimed,
Now we gotta get the moon. We can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings.
As part of the rehearsal, the capsule was pressurized by filling it with 100% oxygen. Then, perhaps due to a spark from a faulty wire, the oxygen-rich atmosphere ignited. The inward opening hatch made rescue impossible. Tragically, all 3 astronauts died in the fire. Their loss had a huge impact on the program. As a result, every procedure, system, and wire was reviewed, so that an accident like this could never happen again. But the Apollo program kept going, now more careful and dedicated to crew safety. They continued to improve the rockets and spacecraft, but without astronauts on board. Apollo 4 marked a major success, with all the Saturn V rocket stages working together for the first time. This was improved upon with Apollo 5 and 6. Apollo 7 had the first crewed flight, testing the craft in low Earth orbit for almost 11 days in space. Apollo 8 was a breakthrough in spaceflight. It was the first time humans left the Earth, orbited the Moon, and returned. On Apollo 9, all 3 modules worked together for the first time. Apollo 10 was a dress rehearsal and return to the moon. Every stage had been accomplished. It was time to attempt the last goal, to walk on the moon. It was the 16th of July, 1969, at Kennedy Space Center, Florida. On the launch pad was the biggest rocket ever built. Standing 111 meters tall and weighing almost 3,000 tons, this is the Saturn V. Inside the top, in a tiny metal capsule, are the astronauts of Apollo 11. Their names are Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. They will make the first attempt to land on the moon.
6,
Roger, we copy.
After 3 days in space, the Apollo 11 astronauts began preparing to slow down and put the craft in orbit around the moon. Unfortunately, this maneuver had to be carried out on the far side of the moon, away from radio contact. A mistake at this time might send them crashing into the moon, or worse, speeding off into deep space with no hope of return.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. All your systems are looking good going around the corner. We'll see you on the other side. Over. Roger.
The astronauts were on their own. There was nothing Mission Control could do but wait.
You're loud and clear, Houston. How are you?
The calculations were perfect to the second. Apollo 11 was now safely in orbit around the moon.
Looks very much like the pictures, but like the difference between watching a real football game and one on TV. No substitute for actually being here. Roger, we concur, and we certainly wish we could see it firsthand also.
It was now time. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin entered the lunar lander, ready to attempt the first ever moon landing. As they detach, Michael Collins is left alone in the main spacecraft. He knows there is a high likelihood that he will be making the return journey to Earth alone. There are 3 possible outcomes to their attempt. They will land, they will abort, or they will crash. Back in Mission Control, Flight Director Gene Kranz and his team monitor the progress of the landing craft.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for powered descent. Retro? Go. Fido. Go. Guide. Go. Control. Go. Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Ecom. Go. Surgeon.
Go.
Capcom, word go for powered descent.
Eagle looking great. Your go. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. 2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag. 47 degrees. Roger. 47 degrees. 1201. 1201. Roger. 1201 alarm.
An alarm sounds. Something is wrong with the computer. Mission Control must quickly decide whether to abort the mission. They choose to continue.
Manual out of gun control is good. Roger, copy.
Armstrong realizes that they are going to miss the planned landing site and are heading for a boulder field.
700 feet, 21 down. 33 degrees.
He takes over control from the landing computer. All those hours of training come into play.
540 feet down at 30 and at 15. 4.5.
Armstrong tries to find a flat landing
30
site,
feet, 2.5 down.
No level? No level.
but the lander is running out of fuel.
30 seconds.
When the clock gets to 0, they'll have to abort.
To the right, level. Down a half. 30 seconds. Forward. Altitude, velocity, light. Straight shadow. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up the set. Contact light. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
Fire back, Columbia. He has landed. Tranquility Base. Eagle is at Tranquility. Over.
Yeah, I heard the whole thing. Fantastic.
They had done it. Every single person in the Apollo program had contributed to this moment. Together, they had put humans on the moon, and they had got there first. Back on Earth, 500 million people watched Neil Armstrong descend the ladder and become the first human to walk on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Minutes later, Buzz Aldrin joined him on the moon. The two moonwalkers had little time to enjoy the scenery. For the next 2.5 hours, they took photographs, set out experiments, and collected different types of rock and soil to bring home. Apollo 11 revolutionized our relationship with space. We had now proved that we could go beyond Earth. We had taken our first steps to exploring the cosmos. When the 3 astronauts returned, they were celebrated by a changed world. They returned to Earth as heroes. Politically, the reason for going to the moon had been accomplished. The space race had been won. The national ideal that dedication could achieve anything, even take you to the moon, had triumphed. For many, this is where the story ends. But the Apollo 11 landing was only the first step in the human exploration of space. With renewed confidence in their spacecraft, NASA set out to explore other areas of the moon. But first they needed to improve their accuracy. Apollo 11 had missed its landing site by 6 kilometers. Only 4 months later, Apollo 12 successfully landed just 200 meters from its target, near an earlier spacecraft called Surveyor 3. They collected samples and set up science stations. These continued to transmit data long after the crew returned to Earth. Apollo 13 was unable to attempt a moon landing.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Okay, stand by there, Dane. We're looking at it.
Early in the journey, an oxygen tank exploded, forcing the crew to abort the mission. Traveling too fast to turn around and fly straight back to Earth, they had to use the moon's gravity to slingshot them back home. The teams in Mission Control worked around the clock trying to save the crippled spacecraft. Over the radio, Capcom talked the crew through every plan the teams had devised to keep them alive. Incredibly, all 3 astronauts survived, but only just.
Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Budget constraints forced NASA to reduce the number of moon missions it had planned. So to increase the astronauts' range of exploration and science, the engineers packed an electric moon rover. On Apollo 15, moon exploration moved up a gear. The first astronauts had engineering qualifications and were able to set up scientific experiments. But NASA now realized they needed a trained geologist to identify the most valuable rocks to study and return. On Apollo 17, Harrison Schmitt became the first scientist to walk on the moon. The samples they returned are still giving us insights into the moon today.
There is orange soil. It's all over. Orange!
But on December the 14th, 1972, Gene Cernan left the last footprint on the moon. No one has set foot on the moon since.
3, 2, 1. Ignition. Right away, Houston.
Looking back, it seems incredible that all this was possible so long ago. But why have we never returned? Apollo proved that humans could get to the moon, but only for short visits, making exploration extremely expensive. The challenge, then, is that if we want to explore space, we must first learn how to live in space. Since Apollo, astronauts have remained within low Earth orbit. Small space stations like Mir and Skylab pioneered technologies for living in space. More countries began to develop their own space programs. 15 nations came together to build the International Space Station. On board this science laboratory, astronauts and scientists have been learning how to live in space for long periods. Their work is helping us to prepare for the next goal, not just to visit the moon for a few days like Apollo, but to live there and explore. We are still learning, but are tantalizingly close to real solutions. Soon, we'll need a new generation of people working together to plan our next great adventure into space. Are you ready? Are you ready for the next giant leap?
Are you ready? Ready to go? Are you ready? Ready for more? Are you ready? Ready for me? Oh my, are you ready? Ready or not, we going.
we'd like to give a special thanks to all those Americans who built those spacecraft, who did the construction, design, the test, and put their heart and all their abilities into those craft. To those people, tonight we give a special thank you. And to all the other people that are listening and watching tonight, God bless you. Good night from Apollo